asked her to sit down. So this is a special meeting for August 2nd, 2023. Madam Clerk, will you note the roll?
Thank you, Mayor Weldon. We have all assembly members present in chambers besides Assembly Member Wahlal Gadak and Assembly Member Smith, who are absent. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Any requests for agenda changes, Mr. Manager?
Mayor, this agenda looks perfect to me.
I'm glad. Okay, for public participation on non-agenda items, we have one person signed up. And it looks like Dave Hanna. Mr. Hanna, are we having him there? There we go. Looks like we're having you over there.
Sure.
Please state your name and area of the town you live in for the record, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the Assembly, Dave Hanna, Back Loop Road. I'm in here because if you remember a couple meetings back, we were here for the stream side setback ordinance, and I testified on that. And at that time, I was under the impression that some sort of a compromise had been reached. So I was going to run with that, and I suggested a couple of changes, which were to no avail. But at that time, I was unaware that the Planning Commission really had no knowledge of what was going on. That's my understanding. And that meeting was hurriedly scheduled for when the chair of the Title 49 Commission was known to be out of town. So that kind of didn't set very well with me, and I kind of thought this through, because this is an unusual circumstance, you know, to just pull this off. You had something from the Planning Commission, it was totally ignored, and a whole new thing came up. And I don't know if we actually violated charter. You folks can do kind of anything you really want to do, but really, that was a whole new ball game. And it really should have gone back to the Planning Commission. It should have gone back to Title 49. You know, I actually called a few of the past commissioners, explained to them the whole process that's gone over the last couple of years, actually, about this stream side setback ordinance. And they were all aghast. They were just aghast. They were, oh, I'd write an excoriating letter to the manager and the director and the assembly. I would resign. I would write protest letters. I mean, on and on and on. And I don't think this is something we should ignore. I think we owe the Planning Commission an apology. I think we should give them a chance to revisit this. I mean, that's why we appointed them, to do this work, read through it, figure out what really needs to be done. Twice they submitted a very thorough proposal to you folks. And the last one, they spent a long time that night going over it, getting back to what they had originally come up with a year prior to that, or maybe a year. And we just ignored it. And I think that's really unfair. I think the Planning Commission does a really difficult job. They're the public's last chance to get justice, if you want to call it, with the bureaucracy. They do a good job. They're good people, and I don't think we should ignore them like this. So I would encourage you to take a look at what went on and see about giving the Planning Commission a chance to revisit this and maybe come up with some new recommendations, because there are some things about this ordinance that might not work very well for the development community. With that, thank you. And I'm going to go enjoy the sunshine.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Hanna? All right, thank you for your testimony tonight. And Mr. Hanna was the only one that signed up, so we will go into our agenda topics. City manager hiring, Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I move that we appoint applicant Katie Hess. I move we appoint applicant Katie Kester to the city manager position as a successor to Mr. Watt with an annual compensation rate of $210,000, and I ask for unanimous consent.
Any objection? Seeing none, she is appointed. And you had some other things to say also.
Yeah. Just wanted to take a moment to thank the recruitment committee, Mr. Bryson, Ms. Uscandies, and Ms. Hale for helping put together a rigorous nationwide search. We got candidates from all over the country. The recruitment committee helped interview the top qualified candidates, and then the full assembly selected who would be interviewing with the full assembly and meeting with senior leadership staff. It became quite clear at the end that we had an amazing candidate in Ms. Kester. Super fortunate to have someone who had been a city manager in Alaska before, someone who had led a major department with the CBJ and had regularly demonstrated her commitment to our community of Juneau. So super happy to have you on board, Ms. Kester.
Thank you, Ms. Wall. Ms. Kester, come on up. Start over there on the handshake. No, start with the handshake.
My boss.
We'll see Ms. Kester pretty soon, shadowing the role. With that, nothing further before the assembly. We are adjourned.
I call the Assembly Finance Committee meeting to order. Ms. Spiegel, will you call the roll or note the roll?
Thank you, Chair Wall. We have all assembly members present in chambers besides Assembly Member Wachlaw Gadak and Assembly Member Smith, who are absent. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Spiegel. That brings us to approval of minutes. Any edits or objections to the June 7th, 2023 Finance Committee minutes? Seeing none, those are so approved. That brings us to agenda topics. Is this Ms. Flick?
Thank you, Chair Wall. Welcome, Assembly members. I hope you got some rest without a July meeting. We have a couple topics for you today for your discussion. They got it. So the first item today is your assembly grant or community grant process. In the packet on page 5, you'll find a memo that was really intended to give you some options as you discuss how you'd like to move forward in the next budget process. Obviously, you all have many opportunities to bring ideas and fundings before this body in various ways. So this particular process is not your only way to bring ideas and projects to the Assembly for action. I basically in this memo laid out 3 different options for you. One is to do a pre-budget process similar to the marine passenger fee, whereby through the manager's office, we would solicit applications, do a public comment process, and then put together a list with the city manager's recommended budget. As the Assembly Finance Committee, you would get a full packet of everybody who applied, comments that were made, et cetera. But you would start out the budget process then with a recommendation as far as which applicants might be awarded. One of the things I wanted to point out is we have several partner agencies, those who are regularly awarded grants from the Assembly for their ongoing operating efforts. You also have some non-competitive grants, such as the grants that fund the 4th of July fireworks and the Douglas Parade, things like that. You could choose to have those omitted from a competitive process per your direction, and those could be included as part of the city manager's recommended budget. We also could go with an option that's post-budget process, whereby through the budget process, you could say we want to set aside X number of dollars for assembly grants. And then after the budget process, say in July, you could determine whether you wanted staff to review applications or committee to review applications, and then make awards in that fiscal year that has just begun. The other option is certainly to do what you've always been doing, get in requests, have those come to you throughout the process. You could take presentations through the budget process and make those decisions as you have in the past. So those are just some ideas to start your conversation. Obviously, this process is yours. We're here to help you. But it was certainly one that felt like a struggle this year, and we wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that process while we had plenty of time to react before we get into the FY25 cycle.
Thank you, Ms. Flick. Questions from the committee?
Chair Wool, excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'd like to note for the roll that Assemblymember Smith has joined us.
Mayor Weldon and then Ms. Hale.
If we use the pre-budget process, that sounds fairly interesting. What would we do? And I'm not picking on them, I'm just stating because it's happened before. The Genoa Community Foundation, one year they wanted to set them out and the next year they wanted a different amount. How would we know how much to put in the, or how would you know how much to put in the budget then? Would we ask them to talk before, or would any increment have to come from the process of the budget? That may confuse you. That was a weird question.
No, that's good, Mayor Weldon. The process is yours to define. So if there are those partnering agencies that regularly get a set amount, you could say, let's assume that that's the starting point, maybe adjust for inflation or costs in very small increments. But if there's a large request for additional, have them apply for that like other grant recipients.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my concern, and maybe concern is not quite the right way to characterize it, but I just wonder for those entities, those groups that are not on this list on page 6, page 2 of the memo, is there only opportunity then to appeal to the Assembly through this grant application that they're going to submit in December and January? And then from then on, they're going to be weighed on that grant application. They won't be coming before the Assembly. That was hard. Anyway, is that correct? Or maybe you're saying we can define what we want, but it just looks like the way you've got this process laid out, they would submit their application. I mean, I'm just thinking, for example, of the climbing wall, and they like scaled it way back. They had a big request, and then through some iterations and hearing what Assembly members had to say and talking to people, they scaled that way back and they were successful. How does something like that fit into this process that you've described?
Assemblymember Hale, under a pre-budget process, the assumption would be that they would apply for what they needed, and through the public comment process and working with staff and questions, that they would refine their amount if they needed. But as I stated at the beginning, groups can contact you anytime to bring forward ideas and projects. So this is certainly not the only method, but it is one way to put everybody on the same playing field, advertise it. Obviously, if we do a different method than's been done in the past, it's going to take a little bit for people to get used to it. But it would be an open method with public comment. It doesn't necessarily mean that they would be in here iteratively talking about things. But again, they would be your rules as to how you wanted to proceed with a grant type process. And I just want to make a note that those entities that are listed on page 6 were ones that we just kind of picked through that looked like were your regular ones. So that is in no way a firm list. Like, we would look to you to determine who you would want to be excluded from a competitive process.
I have Mr. Bryson, then Ms. Klaschewski, then Ms. Hughes Candies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So post-budget to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're working on the budget. We would want this information prior to the completion of the budget. The pre-budget time period doesn't matter as much to me. We could have it a month early, it could be 2 weeks early. The most important factor that I think would help me determining this auxiliary funding is if we had a complete list when we look at it the first time. It was very confusing for me last year when we had part of the funding request and we were trying to make a decision off of that, but then there were other funding requests that weren't in the list. What would we have to do to ensure that we have a complete, what's the complete auxiliary request? What we have to do, like I said, I don't care when that comes, but what do we have to do to make sure it's complete when we see it?
Assemblymember Bryson, I think it's just defining a process and setting a deadline by which you would like to receive notice of those requests.
Easy enough. Thank you.
Ms. Klaschewski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm trying to remember what is current. So some of these, Travel Juno, we've been historically giving them whatever number of sevenths they get. And so when we get these, they're already in the manager's budget with a number, and we do then hear them. So I'm a bit confused about what you are suggesting that's different. I am definitely for getting everything early and setting a deadline and however we do that so that, as Mr. Bryson said, we see them all. So I'm struggling with understanding what you're suggesting and how that's different than what we're doing. There's a number in the budget that it's already, part of it is in the quote manager's budget, and then they might ask for more, and then that's separate. So how is what you're suggesting different than currently we're doing? Maybe Mr. Manager can help because he's been doing it.
Are you asking specifically for the partnering agencies and the non-competitive
Yeah,
grants?
I mean, because we do hear from them during the budget process, but there's already a number in the manager's budget for these things. They're not extra. I mean, the agency might ask for extra, but the manager starts with kind of what they got last year. So I'm a little confused as to what you're suggesting that's different for these. Is it different, or are you just suggesting there be a more formal process for the quote extra ones, which I agree with?
Through the chair, I mean, it's always going to be a fluid process, and there's always, the push me, pull you two-headed llama that wants to go in two directions at once, right? You want to have a process so you can stay on the budget and consider things in context. But community groups are going to have a great idea that's going to be really compelling and timely. And there's a balance in there. And I think that after this last budget process, it made sense to talk about what we're doing. So is it different? Yes and no, I guess. It sort of depends on how we digest and receive and respond to requests from the community.
And I might add to that, if these agencies that are partner agencies and non-competitive grantees are set aside with some quantity of known funding, incremental on what they had the year before, or assume the year before, we could actually hear the progress of their organization throughout the year, not limit it just to that condensed time frame where you all have had a very packed schedule.
Yes.
So we could pull some of those presentations and pull them throughout the year. So you're not hit with all of those sort of non-competitive grantees along with any that you might want to hear during the budget process.
Can I follow up? I mean, I think that's a terrific idea, so we don't have to do it in sunny April or whatever. But I'm still trying to understand if you're suggesting something different than we do. And it seems what I'm hearing, it's kind of, maybe you're only talking about the climbing wall and the things that we get extra. But these things are in your manager's budget for a certain number. I don't think them as competitive. Well, you already say they're not competitive. I'm just trying to understand what you're suggesting and I'm totally for early doing. That's all.
I believe what I was trying to communicate through this was that there are those groups that you include in the budget regularly, the manager includes. And those could be, even though they're considered assembly grants or community grants, you could exclude those to some level from a competitive process.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, okay, thanks.
I have Miss Hughes Scannies and then Mr. Jones.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think I have two questions, but I'm going to try to make it into one question. And it's interesting because these partner organizations, some of them are very tied to the next item on our agenda. So that's, I think it's good to try to separate them in our minds because they are two different processes, but it's hard at the same time to separate them. So I am going to summarize, I think, what I'm hearing for options 1 and options 2, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong. So for option 2, a post-budget process, in the budget process, we would say 1.5 million to community grants. And then once the budget's passed, we work through that. However, we work through that, to be determined. And then and is that correct?
that is
Yeah,
correct.
Okay, you're nodding. And then for option 1, we can choose some people to leave out. When I think of marine passenger fee, we block things out, and I'm in summer, so right now I'm a little blocked out. But I think we receive all these things from the community. Sometimes people say, make a mural with nails in the boardwalk, and we get to see that in a compiled list. But we also see the manager only picked a few. He picked the docks and he picked, bathrooms. He didn't pick the mural. And very occasionally in my own service, have people said, I want to pull the mural off the list because we should do that too, or I don't want what the manager wants. So in scenario 1, we'd have a deadline. Let's say we exclude some people, and then we would also get the manager's recommendations saying, this is who I think you should fund off this community list. Correct?
That is correct.
But
Both
we'd also get the list. So we could say he didn't choose the climbing wall. Unlikely. And then we could say, you should choose the climbing wall and we're pulling it off this list. Is that
That's
accurate?
correct.
Okay?
And you would see perhaps a difference in dollar amount
Right.
as well. And with the full list, with people applying early, you would see all of those details and you could make adjustments as you wanted to through the budget process.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Jones.
Oh, thanks. Just a couple of points that I think I didn't see in the memo. That would be helpful, I think, for the assembly in making a decision about which way to go in terms of competitive versus non-competitive, is to see what the dollar amount is. If you look on page 84 of the budget book, there's about 25 agencies listed under assembly grants. You listed 8 or 9, 2 or 3 on this list aren't on the grant list because I think they were capital. I think you have to decide, is it going to be operating money only, capital money? Are you going to have 2 sets of money, 2 sets of applications? Sea Alaska Heritage was a capital grant. Juneau Youth Services is an operating grant. Juneau Youth Services is a grandfathered one in from when the city operated social services. And when it went away, Juneau Youth Services was guaranteed $35,000 a year. Well, they got that for 20 years. I think just in the last 2 years, we raised that to 50,000. That's not on your list. And so when I compare what's in the budget book to what's on your list, there's a lot of nuance that's not there that doesn't allow the assembly to have a full picture. And if you're gonna do the pre-budget, you're gonna have to have a dollar amount. You're gonna put 3 million out there, you're gonna put 5 million out there. The last assembly meeting, I think they had, you have 7 million, 8 million in requests, and you arbitrarily thought you were gonna try to get to half that. Well, if you're gonna do a budget beforehand, you're gonna have to say, we only have 4 million. Youth services grants, I didn't see in here. I don't know where they are in the budget. But that's an example of youth services grants have what, 1.3 million, and they get 2 million in requests every year. I think there's some nuances in here that really need to be lined out before this assembly would make a decision, or at least I would help make a decision. But I think you have to go with a pre-budget process, and you have to go with something that is as set in stone as possible. Because if you don't have those rules, you can't make exceptions. You can't have somebody come in mid-April and say, I just came up with this great idea and it's timely, like the manager said. Well, if you don't have the rules set enough in the pre, then it's hard to make an exception or say this is too much of an exception. You know, so I think going through the assembly grant list that's on 84, looking at where Sea Alaska Heritage is, because it's not in here, but I know it was a capital grant this year. I think you put more money into United Human Services, but it only shows as a 22 grant in the budget book, at least in the, maybe not in the final budget book, because I didn't have the final one, only the draft one. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to get done to have a little bit better idea of dollar amounts for the assembly to work from. What would be the implications if you separated operating from capital? And then at your retreat, which I won't be part of, you can decide what the value is, the dollar amount you're going to put on that, so that the public knows, like they do with MPF, how much money's out there, that the pool that they're applying for. So, I mean, those would be my sort of general comments, but I think you have to do a pre-budget process. Watching as a public member, this last finance, you have to do a pre-budget. You cannot do a post-budget. That's my comments today.
Thanks. I have Mr. Smith, Mayor Weldon, Ms. Hale, and Ms. Gladys.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I looked at the budget book on this and I felt like, anyway, since it's kind of more of a process question, I mean, anyway, I felt like I had enough information to kind of determine, and I agree with Mr. Jones. We need a pre-budget process. I don't know if I totally agree that we'll have a set dollar amount, but anyway, you know, I think the pre-budget process allows I think one thing that was kind of, that's been lacking and that would be nice would be like standardized information that grantees have to respond with, like, what is the total size of the project? What other sources of funding do they have? Some people do, some people don't. Some people write one letter, some people write an 8-page letter, and it's just kind of all over the place. So having a standardized process, I think, would provide some really beneficial information. I think having it, you know, go through the manager's office finance might help move people into, we might be able to help. I don't know if you're planning on like honing some of their things, but like the climbing gym, for instance, like maybe the better ask for them at the time was a little money for planning or something. So kind of helping folks find the right path, I think, would be useful. And then I think also a standardized process for the presentations, and I like the idea of, you know, the whatever you're calling the partner agencies or non-competitive grants, working them throughout the year as opposed to just trying to jam it all into the budget process. So I feel good with the pre-budget process that I think we do split out some of the partner agency things, the non-competitive grants. I mean, I don't think it makes sense to, you know, upend the Juneau Community Foundation social services grants, for instance. Like that's just seems way too disruptive to do. So yeah, I like the pre-budget process. And then, like, you know, again, I kind of threw out some things that I think would help with the information standardization that would come to the assembly. And again, maybe a little shaping by finance and the manager. So I'm good with that option. Thank you.
Mayor Weldon.
Thank you. I'm intrigued by the pre-budget option. I like the fact that the partner non-competitive groups could be somewhere else beside the finance or the budget season, preferably probably in the fall. So we'd have a pretty good idea what's going on there. Little concerned. I don't mind the manager's office vetting some of the requests at all, but I'm assuming that we would still have the freedom. I guess this is probably the question, that if somebody comes to us, we would still have the freedom to bring something forward as an assembly member, because that's somehow the only way groups or the public can get to something is they come and say, hey, can you put this in there type thing. And then my other question is, what do you envision if something pops up in the middle of the year? For instance, the Glory Hall needs $1 million or the airport needs a map, something like that. So 2 questions tied into one.
Thank you, Mayor Weldon. To your first question about, yes, you would see the full list. So even though it was vetted, and portions would be included in the manager's recommended budget, you would see the full list and could adjust. Likewise, you always have opportunity, whether it's through the Assembly Finance Committee or other committees, to bring forth projects that you feel like are worthy and need to be funded. So whether that be an airport match, maybe it would come through here, or if somebody brings a great public works project, you might filter it through that committee. There's certainly many options for you to work through.
Miss Hale and then Miss Glaszewski, and then I'll put my 2 cents in.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really good, thoughtful comments, Ms. Uscandies, thank you, and Mr. Smith. Everybody's making thoughtful questions and comments. My worry, actually, I think the climbing gym is a great example, and I'm glad you said climbing gym instead of climbing wall, because it is the gym itself, because that changed drastically through the process, and we funded it. So I guess I worry with this process, we're not going to be meeting with people, and that's good because that whole process is so exhausting at that time. But there's not an opportunity to hone the application. I don't know when that opportunity would be, and an opportunity to do back and forth with applicants. I also envision people that I know picking up the phone and calling me as soon as they see the list. And so rather than doing this in the meeting, we're going to have a whole bunch of phone calls to us personally, as people don't like where things landed and they know they don't have an opportunity to come to the assembly. So those are just my concerns. I'm not sure exactly how it's solvable, but that's my concerns.
Madam Chair, I was ready for, if you're ready for motion, I would make one when you're.
Yeah, let me put my 2 cents in and then please. I definitely have concerns about this. I think, I mean, I understand the intent. I would like a better process that's fair to the community. I think it is going to be considerable work. It's going to be considerable work for us. It's going to be considerable work for staff. And I think we need to be really careful about what we want out of the process. I had someone come up to me the day after one of our frustrating finance committee meetings who hadn't gotten funding, and they said, I get it. And what I would like is the assembly to tell us what they want to fund, and then we can, apply for that. And so if we're going to go this route of exploring this option in more detail, I think it can't just be any community, we need to know what we want and know that that's going to actually help clean up our process. And then we're not going to get tons of requests that don't fit that. So that's my word of caution. Glaszewski.
Thank you. I would move that the Finance Committee direct the Finance Office to explore the option of pre-budget process, taking into consideration all the concerns and comments that everyone made here, and come back to the finance committee with a more fleshed out process for doing something different, making it not random, having a standard format so that their things are comparable. Sometimes we get a letter, sometimes we get 10 pages of something. And separating out somehow the ones we continue to fund regularly, whether they're called these words that you made up here or different ones after you look at a bigger list. That would be my motion.
Any objections? Ms. Hughes Candies?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think that's fine to continue to flesh it out and continue to talk about it. I felt like there are lots of good, thoughtful considerations, and maybe it seems like people are sold on option one. I have to admit, I am interested still in option two myself. And maybe there's aspects of that that are not good for staff, since the staff recommendation is for option one. But I was just curious, maybe I'm in the minority here and that wasn't interesting to anyone. I think one positive that I like about it is that it kind of forces us to have a little bit of budget discipline, to say this is how much room we see when we look at the budget and we look at our finances and our mill rate, to say we can afford this much on community requests. And and I love that one is running it against those things, to run it against our goals, run it against our legislative priorities, our CIP list. Well, not really going to be that, but so I don't know if people would be open to continuing to explore that one, but I will remove my objection because I'm fine with hearing more about one.
Smith?
Thank you. Objection for purpose of question, just really briefly. Did we solicit community input in previous years in any way? Or do people just send in things during the budget process?
Through the chair, no, we have not formally done that. If you knew how to contact the assembly and work the process, then you knew how to do it. But if you didn't, then generally you're kind of guessing at it and learning as you go.
Can I try something just as I know we're kind of just doing conceptual stuff, but I would offer an amendment, and that's where a requirement is people have to show how their project or request meets assembly goals as, determined by the ones we have, just so, keeping people honed in a bit. So
I don't want to get too much into the details, so they'll flesh it out, but any objection to that general direction? Thank you. Ms. Hale, and then Mr. Mayor Weldon. Oh, okay.
I would object to the amendment, and sometimes it's the only way the community gets little one-offs that they might not get anywhere. So it might be hard pressed to put it to our goals. I mean, take in case the fireworks, they had asked us for a storage box. How would you fit fireworks into our goal? So, I mean, there's just, I would be really cautious I think the city manager and Ms. Flick are going to try real hard to make sure they go with our goals, but we're going to have little one-offs that may not fit our goals. So I would object.
I think I'll object to listening to that. I feel like I'd like to see what staff come up with. This was their recommendation, and they're trying to think about how to make things easier for us. So go ahead, Mr. Smith.
I was just trying to hone some stuff in, but I will drop my amendment. We can keep going here.
Ms. Hale, a comment on the original motion.
Yes, and it's an objection for purposes of a statement. It's a suggestion, it's not an amendment, but given that we have heard several times lately that people haven't been aware of actions that the assembly is taking that might affect them, would it be possible for the finance committee, finance department, would it be possible, one, for the finance department to notify those who applied for grants last year? So applied for money from the assembly, and two, just make sure before the next meeting, before we talk about this again. And then two, just make sure that there's public information out there. There's Facebook posts, et cetera. So it's not an amendment, just a comment.
Mayor Weldon.
And I would object to the main motions for purposes of a question statement, as Ms. Hale. And I guess it's just kind of a question for the assembly to think about. So I have no problem with the manager vetting some things. Some of the things need to be vetting, but I think that we might want room in our process to at least hear from a few groups, and how we limit that time, I'm not sure, and I'll leave that up to Ms. Flick, but I'll remove my objection.
And I would just say
Dr.
that the motion
Sheffield.
was meant to have you listen to all of us and come up with a one step more that we can look at, including things like that and everything everyone said. And if you can make us all happy, it'd be awesome.
Ms. Flick, any questions for the committee? Are you feeling okay about your direction?
I do have one question for Ms. Hale. When you said to speak to previous applicants or let them know, did you mean as we develop this process? So before we bring back a flesh process, or if we move forward with an option one, make sure we notify those who applied last year that the process is opening by a certain date?
What I'm actually thinking, and thank you, Ms. Flick, what I'm actually thinking is this is going to come back before the finance committee. And it would really be nice to make sure that our community groups know we're talking about it. So before we hash it all the way through, they know how it's going to be changing. It's just, you know, a little bit more robust public contact and public notice. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks.
Mr. Jones.
Maybe this is too much history, but as this assembly thinks about wanting flexibility and wanting people to approach the assembly and the assembly negotiating, part of the reason that we have social service grants are going to the Community Foundation, the Youth Services Advisory Board, and a lot of other places where this assembly spends assembly grants, was past assemblies decided to take it out of the political process of 9 elected officials negotiating with some nonprofits and not negotiating with other nonprofits, and then pushing those nonprofits in a budget session and not pushing other nonprofits. And in their wisdom, the assembly moved that to more neutral bodies. So just keep that in mind as you want flexibility to negotiate the climbing gym in the late hours of an evening versus what would be a good process for the public to be engaged in that was orderly, had a purpose. Just a caution, because I won't be here. But in history, this assembly and past assemblies have taken it out of their own hands just because of that. Thank you.
All right, I'm not sure if we actually officially, any more objections to, no, okay. All right, do people want a break before we go to the next one? All right, that brings us to hotel bed tax allocation. Ms. Flick.
Thank you, Chair Wall. This is a similar topic in that you have a memo before you with some ideas, some concepts, and as finance and staff, we're looking for your direction on what you would like to do. And this is a good opportunity for you to discuss the hotel bed tax distribution. I am not the first to have written a memo on this. On page 8 of your packet is the memo that Jeff Rogers wrote on September 7th, as you all were considering how to perhaps take some hotel bed tax and attribute it to short-term rentals and put it into the Affordable Housing Fund. And so his memo's included. It was well written. It's got some great ideas on the options that we wrote out for you today. The first one is continue with your status quo of allocating the 9%, 4% to tourism promotion, 3% to Centennial Hall operations, and 2% to Centennial Hall improvements. The two that Mr. Rogers had previously suggested, option number 2 is looking at the split of hotel bed tax that is not related to hotels. Hotels are fairly easy to identify in the reporting. And so splitting out that portion that is not related to hotels and calling that from short-term rentals and moving it to the Affordable Housing Fund. Another option that he presented is option number 3, which is to amend the percentages that you all have used historically, but keep a formula in the process for distributing the hotel bed tax. And then the fourth option on the memo here is to move away from a formula and rather set your priorities, perhaps in the retreat or through some method, communicate that to the city manager so that they can include funding from that revenue source to your priorities, meeting the needs of those areas. And with that, different options before you. It is certainly at your pleasure how you want to go. And we just look for your direction.
Ms. Flick, can we start with questions this time? We quickly went to comments last time. Questions, Mr. Jones.
Thank you. Before I comment or ask questions, which may be down the road, when we moved from 7 to 9%, and I was part of that vote, but what I can't remember, was there a sunset on the extra 2%? When is that sunset? And the reason I ask is if there's a sunset on the 2%, then I think any formula that we talk about for future funding needs to exclude that 2% because it is term limited. And I think it had to do with bonds for Centennial Hall or whatever, but
That is correct, Assemblymember Jones. In the ordinance that came to you in July of 2019, the return to 7% starts on January 1st of 2035.
a little longer than I thought. But anyway, I still think that's an issue that needs to be in the forefront as we discuss.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually also have a question, and it's related to Mr. Jones' question. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we ended up with a percentage that we have through a ballot measure. And that ballot measure was approved so that we would earn this additional revenue. Yes, so I just, not having the language from that, it would be very helpful to me to have the language from that and see what we told the voters and what the voters thought was happening with that money. And we don't have it in our packet. So just as we continue to struggle with this, I'd like to be able to see that language. Thank you.
Assemblymember Hale, it's not in your packet. However, to Assemblymember Jones's point, it was a 2% increase. The intent of the assembly to use this increase in the hotel motel room rental tax to providing for construction of capital improvements for Centennial Hall. Tax proceeds could also be used to help pay for general obligation debt service related to Centennial Hall. And that is what the ballot measure was about.
Thank you.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Flick, have we have deviated from the 4, 3, 2%? Do you just know, like in the last few years, how often we've stuck to it? Obviously, there have been complicated hotel bed tax years in the recent history, but.
You can speak to that. Through the chair, Assemblymember Smith, to my recollection, since I've been at CBJ, over the first couple of years due to COVID, we granted less than the percentage due to depressed hotel bed tax receipts. This past budget cycle, hotel bed tax revenues were forecasted fairly high. The 2% split for Centennial Hall capital improvements was more than the debt service in the given year in FY24. So we did not utilize that full 2%. The operating agreement with the JAC to run Centennial Hall, their needs did not come to the full amount of their allocation in the percentage split. And Travel Juneau requested a budget slightly less than what was included in the manager's proposed budget for their allocation. And the assembly made a motion to fund Travel Juneau at 1.2 million, if I recall. So I think really in this past budget cycle is where we've seen the most deviation, because the funding needs of these different allocations were in many cases less than what the allocation provided in terms of revenue.
Thank you. A little, just I guess connected. What is for Travel Juneau, what is the like timing for how we forecast hotel bed tax, and then I believe we like give them a number anyway? Do you know those kind of timeframes for how we provide that to Travel Juneau?
Thank you. Through the chair, I believe the timing is in December, January. Mr. Rogers used to meet with Ms. Perry to discuss the upcoming fiscal year's hotel bed tax forecast. Ms. Perry would build her budget off of that number. As we progress through the fiscal year, we get better and better data because we actually have eyes on the actual remittance of taxes. So the forecast that is ultimately built into the budget can sometimes vary from the forecast that Mr. Rogers had discussed with Ms. Perry during the December, January timeframe.
Sorry, just a brief follow-up on that. So we'd provide a forecast in December to Travel Juneau. They would then build a budget around that. But then as it came back to the assembly during the budget process in April and May, we'd have revised numbers, and then we'd sometimes be choosing not to. Anyway, we'd be then selecting a number after they had kind of already built their budget for the following fiscal year. And therefore, are potentially having to change numbers in their budget 2 months before the fiscal year starts, approximately.
Yes, Assemblymember Smith.
I don't have a question. I have some comments about the 1980
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question then. And I hope this isn't too philosophical, but I can see some justification for tying Travel Juneau's revenue to a percentage, because it incentivizes them to sell the city. I know that's their mission, but if they're successful, they get more funds and can keep growing. For Centennial Hall, I guess I see less of that connection. Is Centennial Hall in any way incentivized to bring in more business by receiving more revenue? Just that, and that might be a better question for the city manager or deputy city manager.
Through the chair, thank you. It's a looser connection, as Ms. Flick mentioned. The Jack contract is funded by 3% of the current 9%. So you could view that as a similar sort of incentive that Travel Juneau would have to grow the usage of Centennial Hall. However, as Ms. Spiegel mentioned, I think it's worth noting that 3%, at least in the last fiscal year, exceeded the stated needs.
Mayor Weldon, a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm assuming that it would be easier on Travel Juneau and perhaps Centennial Hall operations, that whether they get 4%, 3%, as long as they're more stable, that would probably be better for the organizations. And I'm going to put something else in there too. And they are an interesting organization. And I think Ms. Waller, Mr. Smith said it. they're working hard to bring more tourists, but at the same time, if we cap them, we're asking them to work really hard, bring more tourists. Oh, by the way, but you have to with less money now. So it's interesting. Anyway, so my question is, I'm assuming the stability would be more beneficial.
Generally speaking, having an expectation, Mayor Weldon, is easier to work with if you know a percentage. When you're working off of a tax such as the hotel bed tax, you're still doing a little crystal ball forecasting. You can make your best estimates, but if an organization knows we're always going to get X percent of this, it is likely easier to work from than having to negotiate every year.
Mr. Jones.
I agree that a percentage of the bed tax does provide some incentive, but Mr. Smith's point, city borough operations often change at the last minute because of changes in the budget that this assembly makes in May. So Travel Juneau having to adjust their budget in June based on the budget is not different than most operating entities within the city. And secondly, there is a cap on what Travel Juneau can do based on the number of hotel rooms. And if you're going to give them 4%, if all the hotel rooms max out 24/7 for 365 days, there's no room for Travel Juneau to grow unless it goes into Airbnb, and you just regulated that because you're concerned that takes away from the housing market. So be careful what you incentivize, because right now the hotels are full, with one being shut down, right? I think it's Baranoff. Well, Baranoff's open, but maybe not open in the winter. But there is just a certain number of beds in this community. And while Travel Juneau might try to influence a company to come in and build a new hotel, I'm guessing the numbers don't work out, or they would have been building hotels here. Unlike Anchorage, where they build hotels and then they stay empty. But it's important, I think, for us to understand that if you want Travel Juneau to enhance the independent travelers, then they need to spend a lot of time working on that, but that's going to require more hotel space available and not used for crew members for the cruise lines or anything like that. It's going to require an increase in Airbnb if you can't increase the number of hotel beds. So there are some artificial limits, and I don't know what those limits are, but I would think Travel Juneau would understand what those limits are. So they're going to get capped in some way. And they're to help the Jack fill up Centennial Hall. That's part of what I think Ms. Perry talked about in terms of long-term engagements and going out and trying to get a contract for a convention 2 years from now or 3 years from now. But the limits on those are the size of Centennial Hall and the number of hotel beds that are available when a convention wants to come in. So there's a lot of variables to consider that I think go beyond a consideration of whether they should get 4% of the bed tax or 3.9% of the bed tax or a set dollar amount every year. But I think setting an upper limit, no more than 4% or, no less than might be a better way to go based on what you see as a forecast. And this community's getting more and more concerned about the volume of tourism. And I know it's mostly related to people show up in the harbor, but I don't know that if you eliminated 20% of what comes in the harbor, you could replace that with independent travelers. But maybe Travel Juneau could. So you might want to think about a range, You're guaranteed 3.5% based on your goals and objectives and the annual agreement that they sign. I think this assembly negotiated an agreement with Travel Juneau. I don't know how often that gets updated, but if it's updated annually, then you could build that update and the work in there into the budget up to a certain amount. So you might want to consider that.
I'll consider that transition into committee comments. Ms. Gladys.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. So this funding is very unusual for the city, and everybody knows that the state of Alaska has a constitution that says no dedicated funds, and there's a reason. It's because every year there's different priorities, and everybody wants dedicated funds, right? I mean, of course you do. I mean, I worked in an agency that did have dedicated funds. We loved it because we knew if someone bought a gun, we would get money. But this is a perfect example of changing priorities, and Travel Juneau and Centennial Hall operations and Centennial Hall improvements. That is a decision I believe the Assembly should make every year. We make it every year for the budget, for every single department, for the police department, very important department, for the fire department, very important department. And there's no reason I think that we shouldn't make it every year for these functions as well. This is a historical anomaly from resolutions from the 80s. And I don't know why at one point when we were talking about the Travel Juneau stuff, I went back and looked at all those resolutions, and they're from like 1982 and 1987. And it just sat there. I think the last time was 1993 or something like that. So it's super old, and I think this Assembly should revisit it. And I would advocate for, and maybe just to settle people down, you say, not less than 2% or whatever, you could say that. But I just think the Assembly should consider these functions as every other department in the city gets scrutinized every year. The fire department doesn't get dedicated funds. It gets funds it needs, or that 9 people think it needs. So I would advocate for option 4. And give them what they need to do the job.
Mr. Bryson, then Ms. Hughes Candies and Ms. Hale.
It's always fun to talk about money, how much we spend on which organization. But one of the business principles that it applies here is when you're doing really good, the last thing you want to do is cut your advertising budget. We're in a great position. We've got growth. Alaska has a huge reputation. There's a strong desire to come to Alaska right now. This is our advertising arm. And part of the message that they've given out is what is allowing Juneau to be as successful. You might not be able to directly put your finger right on there, but they're giving the message that the community is living right now, and they're encouraging the visitors that we're experiencing right now. And so I hear what you're saying, Ms. Gladys. The only comparison I would compare to that is that the police department knows that it's getting a certain level of funding. And so to have well, if we look at budgets historically, we know that police department has historically been at this X million dollars for so many years. The most important thing we can do is give consistency to the organization that markets Juneau. That's how we stay in line with good business practices for getting our message out there. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I appreciated Ms. Gladys comments a lot, and I think that kind of falls into my way of thinking. And I don't disagree with you, Mr. Bryson. I don't see those two things as contradictory. I think consistency is going to be important for these people who have, or the groups who have historically gotten a percentage. I think we do want to be consistent. And personally, I would say that 9 people, if the manager's budget took a dive in one of these areas, would do something to correct it. I'm really glad that our historian reminded me about the January 1st, 2035. I think that's important to honor. So I would like to see something that says not to be less than 2%, because that's what the voters voted on. I don't expect it would be, but definitely to make sure that I just think this is, I won't restate what you said, and I think that makes more sense to me. What I will say is the idea of using the short-term rental hotel bed tax, putting that in a dedicated, and actually I should have verified this when we were asking questions, but the Affordable Housing Fund, we've chunked money at a time in affirmative votes as past assemblies have. Is it correct right now, we don't have any dedicated funding source like this that's a tax or we do have a 1%? Is it in our 1%? Which expires and then we vote on it again. Okay.
Mr. Manager.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe just to clean up our language, right? Because dedicated fund means something very specific in the Constitution. And I'm thinking you're thinking about like durable funding or ongoing funding, right? And then any fund that you, the Assembly, create, you're one ordinance away from creating a new purpose for that funding. So I think just be careful about the term dedicated fund because it has a very specific constitutional meaning.
I appreciate that, Mr. Manager. So, and thank you for reminding me of the 1%. But what I do like in this memo, I think I like the option of putting it in the manager. And then of course we get to review the manager's budget. But I do like the idea of having a ongoing funding source for the Affordable Housing Fund while we're trying to focus on housing. So with that caveat.
Ms. Hale and then Mayor Weldon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that Travel Juno and the Jack and Centennial Hall improvements need stability. I think that it's a mistake to remove that stability. However, that stability is provided. And actually a percentage is not necessarily stability, because I will disagree somewhat with Mr. Jones in that prices go up. And so you might have the same number of hotel beds, but you have more revenue coming in because the price of those hotel beds has gone up. And so, so I just want to say stability is important. Interestingly, when we talk about transferring hotel bed taxes received from short-term rentals, Travel Juno's mission is to get independent travelers here, and often those independent travelers are actually in short-term rentals. So that's just a wrinkle. And I think that we're talking this is vague, and we're talking in possible scenarios. And really what we need to do is we need to be talking, having this conversation around actual dollar amounts, because it's really hard to have the conversation around the idea of what it might be, because we don't know what it's going to be, and we don't know from year to year. So I don't know exactly what I want, which option. I don't think option 4 is good. I don't know that status quo is good, because sometimes those percentages don't work out, but it's very vague right now, and we need more specificity. Thanks.
Mayor Weldon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I appreciate the historical knowledge of Mr. Jones and Ms. Gladysevsky, but this one, I see this one just as a little bit different, and I'm not apologizing or anything for my support of Travel Juno. I have been, but you also have to remember Centennial Hall. We get beat up a lot because we don't take care of our buildings. And this is one time that we put money aside every year to take care of our buildings. So why would we mess with a good thing? I'll throw a motion out there and we'll see if it flies anywhere, if you're ready for that.
Go ahead.
And it kind of incorporates a little bit of what Ms. Hale is. I would ask the Ms. Flick to present to us options 2 and 3 for further discussion with numbers attached to them. So that would be transferring the amount of hotel bed tax received from short-term rentals, or redesign the historical percentage. So that would be my motion.
And you're not, for clarity, you're not removing option 4, you're just, we all know what that looks like. So you're asking to flesh out 2 and 3. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can I,
Sorry, I didn't make my motion that clear, but that is what I intended.
no, that makes sense. Any objections to that? Ms. Gladys
I object if it means 4 is off the table, because I would still strongly, for the reasons everybody competes for funds every year. You give, and I agree with Ms. Uskanias, because Mr. Bryson, I am also advocating for stability and continued funding of those functions for sure. But 1 year, I mean, they're building a budget to a number, and maybe they need more than that, or maybe they need less than that 1 year. I mean, I don't know. They should get what they need, or what 9 people think they need, just like the police department gets what 9 people think they need, and et cetera. So I'm going to object to the motion if 4 is off the table.
I think Mayor Weldon said 4 is not off the table. She just wants more information on 2 or 3.
Exactly. Keep all 4, but flush out numbers for 2 and 3 so we can check out numbers.
Mr. Jones.
I think if you flush out the numbers for 2 and 3, if you eventually decide to move toward 4, you have some baseline numbers that you're going to talk about in terms of how you might instruct the manager to build that dollar amount into the budget. And then the process that we just discussed in the first memo, whether or not Travel Juno is a competitive or non-competitive competition for whatever numbers you put into number 4 or number 3 or number 2 are going to come out. But if you don't have the numbers for 2 and 3, then you're just guessing on 4, and you might as well get the numbers on 2 and 3. And then if
Sure,
you
fair enough.
adopt, move on to number 4, you're good. So I would support it.
Go ahead.
Accept that as a friendly and flush out numbers for 2, 3, 4.
And I'm also curious, to me, what I'm hearing from the body is we don't want 1. We want to do something to bring more funding to housing. Is that also what I'm hearing? Go ahead, Ms. Hale.
Thank you. Affordable housing is important. We have other ways of funding affordable housing. I am not just concluding that we need to use some of this hotel bed tax for affordable housing. That's actually, I don't agree. I mean, that's not my conclusion here. I think 2 and 3 are good, and I think we need to be looking at everything. As Ms. Gladys has said, we have a budget process and we use that budget process. Maybe we fund affordable housing some other way. So I wouldn't want to limit myself to saying, yes, we are going to use some of the hotel bed tax for affordable housing. Not at this point. We may, but I don't want to limit myself to that. And if I could just add, when this comes back, if we could have the language from that ballot measure, that would be, and the information for the voters, that would be great. Thanks.
Mayor Weldon.
I would probably agree with your finding, but again, the motion is bring all 4 back with numbers flushed out for 2, 3, and 4.
Ms. Flick, are you clear on what the body is asking you? I'm not sure, but you
Sure,
look,
well, I believe that I
clearer than
am
I do.
clear. We are going to go back, pull some, probably several years of numbers for you to look at as they would look for options 2, 3, and 4. Along with that, you'll get the status quo, what you actually did historically. So we can frame those, make sure you have the language from the ordinance. And yeah, we can bring that back for you.
Just Gladys.
One thing, if the Ms. Hale asked for the most recent 2%, if there's value in the ones from the 80s, I can't remember what they say, and if they're not operative, maybe they don't matter, but you might think about those if you think it's appropriate.
Very well.
Any other comments? All right, we will move on. I don't expect. Keep going.
Mike.
If people have a ton of questions, we can take a break, but I asked for this to be in here because we never actually got a full, the final audit report. So I think this time is just if we have questions that you all can answer. Any questions on the FY22 audit from the Assembly? Mr. Jones.
Thank you. I was surprised. This is the first audit I'd read in 9 or 10 years that seemed to express a lot of concern about what was going on. And I don't want to delve into all of that, but when you get to the back toward the audit and then the last part of the audit, when it talks about internal control, in here, there is a plan of correction. And it does say what is planned to be done. And I guess my only question would be, do you feel that you're on track with that? Given that this is the 1st of August, and I imagine the auditors are going to be coming in the end of September. And so I was just, where are you on the plan of correction?
Thank you. Through the chair. We are actively working towards these items. We have had significant turnover in finance over the last couple of years. And with that, some knowledge change. It's exposed where we've had a lot of tribal knowledge and not things written down, policies that people knew but weren't exactly written down. So actually the auditors have been in. They have already started their field samples. Things are going well. We have our first major deadlines week after next, where we'll start closing down certain subsystems. And one of the big changes that our controller took on this year was we haven't regularly closed out each accounting month with hard closes. And there are certain processes, particularly related to capital improvement projects, that are a little more complex. And those had traditionally been done only as a year-end kind of transaction. And so our controller, Ms. Knoll, actually had those capital improvement projects go through and close out the first 3 quarters of the year back in April, go through that closing process, do all of the mechanics that go along with associating costs to their various capital projects, making sure all the drawdowns were done. And so we are in a much better place just even starting than we were a year ago. Time still has to pass. We have a lot of things to get done. The team's working really hard together. We've got great communication. And it is my plan to have a very clean and timely audit this year.
Mr. Jones.
I guess the follow-up is that one of the major concerns and one of the major processes that they wanted finance to look at. And I remember there are other departments other than lands involved, but they emphasize a lot of issues around leases and lease valuations and how you document those. And that was a pretty short little paragraph in the corrections plan, but I assume it's taking you and other departments a little longer than maybe this audit. Do you feel you'll still be some issues around leasing, or you think that may be cleaned up enough that it won't affect this year's audit?
Thank you. And through the chair, the GASB pronouncement with regards to leases and how those needs to be documented. Last year was the first year that we had to include them in our financial statements in that particular method. And so we had a huge learning gap. I think that we've taken great strides forward. We've worked with our auditors to better understand. We've had other examples to look at from other entities. And we actually finished this afternoon about 12:15, 2.5 days of accounting training with a well-versed former GASB employee with a CPA firm came in and walked us through a lot of those questions, particularly as it relates to the leases, which was just enacted last year. We have a new item we have to address this year, which is subscription-based information technology, which is also a very large pronouncement to tackle this year. So I don't know that it will be perfect, but I do think leases, we're much better off than we were a year ago. And the subscription-based software is very similar to the leases. So we're able to learn in that process.
Mayor Weldon.
This has a little bit to do with kind of Mr. Jones' question. So you said that the auditors were coming next month, I think you said. But looking in here, your proposed completion date of corrective plan was January 31st. So are they just coming to do a temperature check and then they'll really look at you at the end of the year, or what? Or are you done early and they can sign you off? How does that work?
Great question, Mayor Weldon. The auditors actually work with us for several months. They do some what they call field sampling. So they want to look at invoices that we paid and did it have the proper process for signing off on approvals before we paid the invoice. They want to look at deposits that are done by departments. They'll go out. Last year, they went out to the swimming pools to see how are they doing cash handling. They look at the various components that make up our financial statements, and they will do that. They started in July. I think they started July 10th. And they're just working on different aspects through that field sampling through the middle of September, I believe. We have a deadline coming up in a couple of weeks where we need to start closing down our subsystems so that we can have that timely rolling up of our financials. And so as we work through those different processes, we close certain things out. We're just in touch with the auditors constantly. They'll look at different components as we complete them and work through it. We expect to be able to give them our first full draft of the financial statements the end of October. And then they will go through and do a review typically right around Thanksgiving. They will come back with questions, things that they need, but then it's just a finalization then through December, and they typically get published right at year end.
Ms.
I just have a
Kladashevsky.
quick question. There's a page here about the Bartlett purchasing process, Bartlett Regional Hospital Enterprise Fund. I thought Bartlett had its own audit. And so is this a fund that the CBJ Finance Department controls or something? Why, how come this one's in there? I thought there was a whole different universe for that.
Great question, Assemblymember Gladaszewski. It is a separate universe, and yet it's still our universe. So both the school district and Bartlett Hospital are audited independently, but their financial statements roll up into the city and borough of Juneau as a whole. And so findings that they might have with the school district or the hospital ultimately roll into the city's finding.
So that's the one page.
Correct.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Great questions. Thanks, Mr. Jones and everybody else for their questions. And thanks, Ms. Flick. Have these findings affected our bond rating, affected our ability to get bonds?
Great question, Assemblymember Hale. No, we were rated by Standard & Poor's back in March for the parks bonds that we issued in the spring, and we maintained our AA+ rating.
Questions from the committee? Seeing none, that brings us to next meeting date, September 6th, 2023. And with that, whatever time it is, we're adjourned.